So first of all, let's have a look at generations and life cycles in early modern era, from approximately 1500 to 1800. In the early modern period, life stages were approached as natural rather than social phenomena. There was a particular interest in the life stages of childhood and youth developed from the 16th century onwards. How were young people and their progression from infancy to adulthood imagined? What behavior was expected of them? What did these expectations have to do with existing power relations in early modern society? And did the young youth possess some space to make their own subculture? In 1658, the Moravian educator Johann Amos Comenius published what was to become a highly popular school book that incorporated visual images in language education. One of the images in the book was a staircase representing the 7 ages of men and women, explained by the words you can now see on the screen. In the middle of the 17th century, it was not a new idea to depict life as a staircase. Many versions of the ladder of life circulated. They were based on life stages theories rooted in the ancient period. There existed a widespread idea that the stages of life were distinguishable from each other, as they all had their own typical characteristics. Moreover, the theorists all started from the assumption that age differentiation had a natural instead of social basis. They often took their inspiration from the theory of the 4 humas developed by the physicians Hippocrates and Galenus in the antiquity. The general idea was that the human body consists of 4 humas: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, that directly correspond to the 4 elements with their own qualities: air, hot and moist; fire, hot and dry; earth, cold and dry; and water, cold and moist. Health was achieved by the right balance of the humus. However, the desired balance varied according to changing circumstances, including age. The dominance of cold and dryness was characteristic for older people, who were thus allowed to be a bit melancholic. Young people's temperament was naturally dominated by heat and moisture, and could therefore be characterized as sort of expansive, sanguine. It was expected of them to be like that. This system of thought shaped views of age differentiation. It was considered a natural, even physical approach to display a different behavior than the young. The idea of a fixed life cycle functioned as a disciplining instrument. It assigned people ineluctable qualities and demanded they show the behavior and talents appropriate to their age. Now, there is this question of whether early modern era is the era of the discovery of children. Given the fact that children were situated as lower people at the bottom of the stairs, to what extent were they actually considered people? How were they valued in society? The French historian Philippe Ariès argued that Europe long viewed children as incomplete adults and discovered the child only in the 16th and 17th centuries, when painters started to express the emerging emotional relationship between adults and children. Although many historians rightly question such idea of a sudden birth of childhood, the early modern period did witness several pivotal events that spurred the interest in children and child education. Among these events were the rise of print, humanism, and the Reformation. German theologian Martin Luther argued that religious and social change depended on the education of new generation. His view of children was, however, not very optimistic. He assumed that children had a natural propensity for doing the wrong thing. But by drumming the right ideas and knowledge into children from their first years onwards, people were able to suppress negative tendencies and to develop positive alternatives. What they learned during the childhood, Luther argued, determined the way they were able to act, behave, and believe as grown-up adults. Compared to the age of Reformation, the Enlightenment developed a more positive, optimistic view of childhood. The English philosopher John Locke viewed the child as a tabula rasa, which should be inscribed by empirical and physical experiences and guided by strict but tender educators. In a more radical way, the Genevese writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau promoted the idea of natural education, grounded in the child's own exploration of their rural environment. What these Enlightenment voices share is a plea for an educational style that encouraged children to learn on the basis of their own observations and curiosity. This plea should be viewed against the background of the optimistic conviction that society can be sort of engineered and that humankind as such will improve when new generations are granted a pathway to intellectual and moral progress. In the second half of the 18th century, teachers, authors, and publishers helped to carry out this Enlightenment program by developing new school types and innovative children's books that stimulated young readers to interact with their surroundings. The creation of child-targeted books and toys demonstrates that children were increasingly granted their own culture, characterized by cheerfulness and carefree atmosphere. While children were taken more and more seriously as a social group with its own identity, they also became even more excluded from the real world, the world of the adults. Although adolescence has long been perceived as a modern invention, historians nowadays assume that early modern people also gradually developed into adults by means of, and as such went through a period of youth that was expected to end at the moment of their marriage. Although youth culture is a contested phenomenon in early modern Europe, it is known that groups of youth were able to set their own subculture. Thanks to the growth of universities, male student cultures revolving around singing, drinking, and socializing outside the house proliferated throughout Europe. In 15th century Florence, young males also used clothing. Young women, in turn, were far less visible and audible, especially the daughters of the elite. In early modern Russia, for instance, high-ranking young women wore veils outside their residence, sat behind screens in churches, and moved around Moscow in closed carriages or sledges. Overall, the degree of agency youth experienced in practice largely depended on the young people's gender, class, and geographical location. Now let's have a look at the 19th century. Life cycles, intergenerational relations, and forms of familial conviviality dramatically changed in 19th century Europe. A wide array of societal changes played into this transformation. The Code Napoleon and the various national forms of civil law succeeding it codified and thus redefined familial and marital relations, as well as questions of inheritance and the family life. The Industrial Revolution and subsequent urbanization drew more and more families from the countryside to the cities. These families adapted their new surroundings and work, and in so doing, changed the way their members lived and worked together. Innovations in medicine, food, and sanitation raised life expectancy and therefore prolonged the life cycles. Century, the introduction of the welfare state, especially old age pensions, and the expansion of primary education created phases in the life cycle in which Europeans were either not yet allowed to enter working life and thus contribute to their family's income, or in which it was no longer necessary for them to work. One of the main drivers of the historical change was industrialization, which went hand in hand with urbanization. Growing cities with lively industrial and service sectors drew in more and more Europeans from rural areas. In Germany, for example, 64% of people lived in communities with less than 2,000 inhabitants in 1871. But decreased to about 40%. Living in urban areas and working in industrial or service jobs forced families to change the ways they lived and worked together, as well as how individual family members related to each other. Strictly regimented industrial and clerical work in specialized factory or office spaces dissolved the old mode of family cohabitation, in which the family's house was an economic as well as private space. It transformed the family, creating a spatial distinction uncommon in pre-modern Europe. Urban families adapted to that separation in different ways. Among the urban middle classes, this differentiation of space reinforced the model of a nuclear family with a male breadwinner, a housewife, and their children. It strengthened the patriarchal power of the father, since family life was mostly built around the needs of the breadwinner. In these urban middle-class families, the private home vacation from work. Although urban working-class families also experienced the separation of the economic and the domestic sphere, their experience was quite different from the middle classes. Working-class families usually lived as extended families in rather crowded apartments. Often, they had to take in lodgers, non-family members living in the same apartment for a certain sum of money. In these working class families, the women and sometimes even the children were often part of life much less centered around a single person. There were more breadwinners. Due to the harsher conditions and longer working hours of working class jobs, working class living spaces were not regularly used for recreation from work. This situation was barely comparable with the middle-class lifestyle of the nuclear family. Yet, skilled workers on the brink of moving up into the lower middle classes often strove to imitate the nuclear family model with a sole male breadwinner. The quick influx of mostly low-income families into the cities, first, during the early industrialization, mortality rates in urban areas were often significantly higher than in rural areas, mostly due to overcrowdedness, harsh working conditions, and especially to a lack of public sanitation and clean water, which led to infectious diseases such as cholera and typhoid fever. This made it quickly apparent to urban authorities and social reformers that newly industrial cities had to be carefully planned. Although early industrialization and urbanization eventually went and gave way to an increase of the population and a prolonging of life cycles, mortality rates all over Europe were strongly reduced. Cheap, industrial, yet nutritious products such as meat extracts became available to almost everyone, and there were important advancements in medicine, public health measures, and improvements to public sanitation. These trends led to Europeans getting older, backed by the invention of vaccination and the emergence of bacteriology. More and more infants born to European families now lived to see childhood and adulthood. And of course, the decline of infant mortality varied greatly across Europe and even regionally within European countries. This demographic transition did not just lead to a rejuvenation of the population. Better health conditions also led to the aging of populations. At the end of the 18th century, only 1 in 5 French people reached their 60th birthday. But by the beginning of the 20th century, more than 1 in 2 would. Of course, there were important geographic and class differences in this trend. Old age became more than ever a matter of social class. The promise of deserved rest after work life was slow to be fulfilled for working class populations. Although mutual aid funds, which included old age allowances, developed during the 19th century, many indigent old people still depended on public charity or that of religious orders, and the conditions were extremely harsh. Of education, a structured, institutionalized education, has come to mark the early lives of all people in Europe and far beyond. Firstly, it demarcated between an age of carefree play and the age of academic learning, a frontier that has become more blurred with the growing focus on academic as opposed to play-based learning in the childcare before mandatory schooling begins. It has also created a strong sense of belonging to a very specific age group, a specific year group even, the class, the school class, the classmates. Yeah? Education has made youth last longer. While there are important regional differences concerning the relationship between education and family generational dynamics, it is remarkable how many of the above-mentioned trends are transnational, despite education being since 19th century one of the important areas of the intervention for each country's government. So now let's have a look at the 20th century. While the concept of familial generations and eventual conflicts between them has been depicted since the time of ancient literature, antiquity, the concept of social generations took shape only in the 19th century. French philosopher Auguste Comte claimed that social changes had a lot to do with generational changes. The first theory of generations as a sociologist, Karl Mannheim, who defined a social generation as a group of individuals of similar ages with the common historical experience of important events within a set period of time. Another influential theory of generations belongs to American historians William Strauss and Neil Howe, according to whom historical analysis indicates that the values, behavior, and worldview of successive generations show a repeated cycle lasting over 80 years and consisting of 4 stages or turnings: high, awakening, unraveling, and crisis. During the 20th century, describing generations and understanding their behavior was considered to be more and more important. Life cycle and generational issues became highly thematized. To understand generational preferences is now considered crucial for winning votes, expanding consumerism, managing labor markets, and therefore the capacity to foresee social changes in order to succeed in politics and in business. And also like to understand one's children, for example. Since the last decade of the 20th century, generational affiliation in both public discourse and interpersonal communications, Generation X, the Zoomers, the Boomers. Yeah, so let's have a look at youth culture and youth subcultures before the 1860s. At the beginning of the 20th century, European youth remained divided along gender and class lines. Although girls had a better access to education and joined the labor market in increasing numbers, marriage and founding a family was still regarded as an inevitable path to womanhood. Even though upper and middle-class young men were able to experience a sense of generational identity and sometimes develop an autonomous youth culture while attending boarding schools and at university, for most young men from the popular classes or settings, the transition to working life often took place just after primary education. However, in most European countries, military service became a necessary rite of passage and a test of manhood. Heavy casualties of World War I would consequently convey the idea of a lost generation of young men. The Roaring Twenties saw the rise of new youth cultures. In well-off circles, the so-called bright young things, but also as well as new forms of women's emancipation in the form of the so-called flappers. The ideological indoctrination of young people was a central feature of mid-20th century totalitarian regimes, which founded new compulsory youth movements such as the Hitlerjugend in Germany, Balida in Italy, or Komsomol in the USSR. World War II disrupted generational relations. In Britain, 800,000 children were evacuated from urban areas to escape the Blitz. In Germany, tens of thousands of troops resorted to the black market and petty crimes in order to survive. Youth delinquency was on the rise, and the idea of a generational crisis gained ground. But it should be put into a perspective. Although there was this notion of crisis, and also the post-war youth began to question the responsibilities of older generations for the war, as well as for the emerging nuclear threat and decolonization in the post-war order, opinion polls show that most of them identified with their parents' view of the society and political beliefs. Change was, however, on the way. In the context of the baby boom, the raising of school-leaving ages and the democratization of education, a distinct youth culture, cutting across class and gender lines and identified by its own cultural practices and consumption patterns. In a time of affluence and full employment, teenagers experienced an unprecedented increase of their purchasing power and became a new target for consumer and cultural industries. Clothes, such as miniskirts, records, rock and roll, radio shows, Salut les copains in France in the late 50s, magazines like Bravo in West Germany, and movies, Rebel Without a Cause, were specifically aimed at the new Americanized generation. Youth culture also implied new uses of space and leisure time. Young people would meet in coffee bars, all the more popular when equipped with a jukebox and pinball machine, or dancing and music venues, but also in fun fairs, amusement piers, stadiums, or more simply, the locally monitored than their male counterparts, would develop a specific bedroom culture centered around their current interests, be it fashion or pop idols, and facilitated by the diffusion of new portable products, including the transistor radio and the record player. Others, nevertheless, took an active part in youth subcultures, subverting gender roles and shocking public opinion with open display of sexual desire, Beatlemania being one example of that. The lines of conflict between the generations were not as sharp as often suggested. Research shows political protests and the goals of their children, making it important to differentiate between family or generational relations and public ones. Public generational relations were often strained during the protests of the long 1968 and afterwards. Left-wing activism even led to conservative electoral backlash, securing elections for conservatives in Denmark and in the US in 1968, or Great Britain in 1970, for example. Despite the backlash, despite the explicit radicalism of activists, there was no deep-seated or open hostility between generations. In fact, most Western European countries lowered the voting age to 18. They who took part in the 1868 did not represent their entire generation. Although the degree of working class activism in the 1968 movements varied between countries, being especially high in France and Italy, protests were mainly carried by highly educated middle and upper class youth. In the 1990s then saw the emergence of neo-tribal subcultures, ranging from ravers to young men provocatively displaying fascist symbols. All these developments hint at the intimate relationship between media, consumerism, and youth. With the rise of the internet, new global and local youth cultures have emerged, presenting a very interesting topic to watch out in the future. Thank you very much.